I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Mary Wilde, self-described Freudian Cinephile and host of the Projection series held at the Freud Museum, London. She's also co-host of Projections podcast. Mary Wilde has a Projections course coming up at the Freud Museum, which will be online April 18th and is on the Joker. You can sign up through the Freud Museum website, freud.org.uk. We'll be discussing the Freud series on Netflix. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Available from Trapart Books, 2019. Now also available on iBook and Kindle. Please visit our publisher's website, www.trapart.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. I'm excited to talk about the Freud show.
Me too.
So should we jump into it? I'm so excited to talk about the Freud show.
Let's just get started. Okay. I'm so happy that I finally get to talk about it because I feel like I've been anticipating it for so long.
Exactly. What did you think of it?
Well, I have kind of mixed feelings about it. I would say I really did enjoy it overall. It's one of those things where it was the last episode that really wrapped up everything for me, and I got to appreciate it more about what it was trying to communicate about the teachings of psychoanalysis and Freud's process about how he arrived at his theories. I feel like everything sort of fell into place, and I understood, looking back, some of the symbolism of what was intended to be communicated. I just sometimes along the series, like along the 8 episodes, I felt a little at times frustrated when Freud wasn't in the scenes. I was like, I want to know more about Freud. I want him to be there,
Yeah, it's like, no, I totally agree. I was really into it in the beginning. Then like episode 5, we should say, disclaimer, we are going to give away the show. So if you have not watched the show yet and you want to, go watch the show and then come back because we are going to talk about the show. But episode 5, when they had the like full-on blood-soaked demonic possession orgy scene, then I was like, God. Okay, now they've gone too far. Now you finally lost me. But I agree that by the last episode, they kind of tied it all together and made more sense. So that I was like, by the end, once they wrapped it up, I was happy with it again.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm kind of intrigued by the creators because I know it was made by, so this is obviously the Freud Netflix series. It's made by Marvin Kren, Stefan Brunner, and Benjamin Hessler. And I have it on good authority that they did quite a thorough research about the history of, the events that took place in Freud's life and his influences and, the people that he knew, etc. And in fact, he even, like the creators, I believe Marvin Kren, he visited the Freud Museum in London, where I do my lecture series. Mm-hmm. To get information about, obviously the sort of data that they keep there. So it's good to know that they did their research and their homework. And I was really kind of pleased to see lots of little details about his life sprinkled through the whole like series, like just little things like the chow dog and
Hmm.
the fact that there was a patient called Bertha Pappenheim. But what I most want to know, actually, I wanted to ask you about it, Vanessa, is like what like the symbolism of the character of Fleur Salome. So she obviously shares her last name with Lou Andreas Salome, Freud's good friend and colleague,
And the first woman psychoanalyst.
and the first woman psychoanalyst, exactly.
Hmm.
And I wanted to know, because I don't really know that much about her, and I kind of was wondering. Obviously, this is all a fictionalized, TV series. It's not at all intended to be biographically accurate. It's sort of like almost like fan fiction, I would say.
Right? It's like fan fiction. Totally. That's
And I just
totally what it is.
it totally is, right?
Yeah.
And it's like total fantasy and like, and we know that Freud obviously had an interest in the occult.
Hmm.
So sort of playing with that, and they obviously embellished his relationship with Arthur Schnitzler, who Freud did know very well in Vienna. They exchanged a lot of letters, but they never met each other in
Hmm.
person. And so I like how this kind of TV series is sort of engaging with all this material, but in a total fantastical way. And I kind of wanted to know what you thought about the Fleur character. Like, what did she present? I was really intrigued.
Yeah, that's a good point. She definitely, I mean, she's clearly the hysteric psychic,
Yes.
right? Um, I tend to believe, I choose to believe that Freud did not sleep with his patients. I know that
Yeah.
Jung did, and I know a lot of them did. Um,
Yeah,
but
Lacan.
something in me just will not believe that Freud did. I just see Freud as this like really like patriarchal, paternal, like proper
Yeah.
guy. And he had Martha, and he had his 6 kids. And I don't know,
Yeah.
I just feel like Freud wouldn't go there. But how do I know? I don't. So for me, it was really hard to see Freud going there. I was like, no, that was Jung. That's not Freud. But also, maybe he fantasized about it. Maybe we could see them as
Exactly.
fantasies, like his scene masturbating in the tub to the hysteric
Yeah.
psychic patient. I mean, I don't know, it's amazing. I'm really intrigued by who these creators were, and like what, like
Yeah.
I want to know what they were doing and how they came up with this, because like you said, it's fanfic is like the best way to describe it. It's like this like murder mystery psychic show, and like you can have like I understand a murder mystery psychic show. I understand even Freud with a murder mystery. Like Danny Novas said that there was like a Sherlock Holmes book and film
Huh?
where they kind of wove Freud in at some point in the 70s, and that it's like Sherlock Holmes and Freud solving cases, and I could even understand that a bit. And now I have to read that and watch that film. Um,
Oh,
Apparently
wow.
that's called 7% Solution, but it's like having
Uh,
all three, like the psychics and Freud and the murder mystery. It's like it's
yeah.
almost too much. But I kind
Yeah.
of feel like it fits these times though. It's like we kind of need that right now.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And you're right. And it kind of fits in with how Freud liked to compare psychoanalysis to detective work. Like this kind of forensic element of psychoanalysis where you arrive at the scene and there's been some sort of trauma or chaos or acting out, and then you retrace the steps and you look back at what led you here. And this kind of yeah, I suppose retroactive technique. And yeah, I agree. It's sort of funny to see representations of Freud as this sort of eroticized being outside of his marriage, because I really relate to how you perceive him as well. Like I was a little bit almost like scandalized to see the scenes
Yeah.
of, him kind of like having sex with Fleur, and I thought, oh my God, what about Martha? You're so devoted to her. And he really was. From what I've read about him, he was a very faithful man. And I guess I kind of also like to reconcile what I saw with the idea that it was just pure fantasy. And probably it did happen many times that he might have fantasized about other women, but he and Martha had an understanding where she didn't try and be possessive over his fantasy life. Like there was this
Hmm.
kind of respect and um, acknowledgement of each other's autonomy, which I think is probably what happened.
Yeah, I can. That makes sense for me. Also, maybe we're just like good hysterics, so we just like can't imagine the father figure that way. Only for us, right? Anyway.
Yeah.
And as far as Salome, I know that the real Lou Andre Salome was like a great hysteric as well, I'll say. And I think
Yeah.
she was like had relation with like Nietzsche and stuff like
Yeah.
that. Like she was a little scandalous in that like really fantastic feminine way. So
Yeah.
maybe they were pulling off of that.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. Kind of in a way, referencing her as a woman ahead of her time, someone who disturbed the Viennese or the kind of Victorian status quo at the time. Because she was, yeah, it's kind of interesting to see this kind of possessed character of two minds and the way that they used all of that symbolism, a lot of it is from really like horror tropes, horror movie tropes, horror literature tropes of people being possessed, secret occult societies, which also kind of ties in with a lot of what Arthur Schnitzler wrote about, like obviously his book Dream Story, which was adapted to Eyes Wide Shut.
I didn't
Um,
know that.
yeah, yeah. So Arthur Schnitzler wrote the original story. It's a great little novella called Dream Story, and that was adapted by Frederick Raphael into Kubrick's film. And so
Wow.
there's some great scenes right at the beginning of this show, in the maybe first or second episode, where we see Arthur Schnitzler and Freud attending these like kind of like risque parties that look like they may be orgies or something, and there's masked figures. So
Yeah.
it's maybe even suggesting that this might have even been where Arthur Schnitzler got his inspiration, the kind of risque element of Vienna.
Right. That's wonderful.
Mm.
Yeah, I hadn't picked that up. That's wonderful. Now I want to read that too. Now I have new books to read.
Oh,
Yeah,
you're
but I
gonna love
do like
it.
how Salome like she ended up being this like really independent spirit, and it's also speaking to like the fact that old people in the hospitals were women. It's just like demonizing women, and like of course women were acting out hysterically. They were trapped in this like society that was really rigid, and they didn't have any choices, and they couldn't have education, and they couldn't have their own careers. They were just trapped in these like mother roles, and they were
Wow.
acting out all over the place. And Fleur Salome, she didn't fall into that role. She was acting out, and then she ended up escaping.
Yes. Yeah, she was kind of an outlaw in the end. She was on the run and she was hunted by Viennese authorities, Austrian authorities, and she sort of found her, I guess, her element in that state of being in chaos, in a sense.
Yeah, I like how he wanted to take the demon whatever thing out of her, and she said no, that's part of me, and she wanted to
Yeah.
just like integrate all the selves instead of like ridding herself of one part of herself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost as if the hysteric condition was portrayed in the series as having a kind of teaching, like creating a teaching moment for the young Freud, who was like coming to grips with his own theory and trying to build psychoanalysis, kind of teaching him that the state of total, like normal psychology doesn't really exist. We're always tormented. We're always trying to resolve something. There's always going to be conflict. You can't completely rid yourself of it. You just have to try and somehow confront it and integrate it into yourself. And that makes you more powerful, actually.
Exactly, exactly. It's the trying to cut it off or ignore it that makes it keep coming back stronger. You have to integrate it and like accept all the parts of yourself so you can like work with yourself Yeah, and be more integrated and strong. And he did learn all of psychoanalysis from working with hysterics.
Yeah.
And I also love that they have Breuer in there, and he talks about the patient Pappenheim, where she had a hysterical pregnancy. But
That's
then
right.
when I saw it in the show, I started thinking maybe he was really sleeping with her too, and that's why they say her pregnancy, like in his version that's written that we can read, it's like she made up this complete fantasy of having this pregnancy with him that was total fabrication. But maybe he was sleeping with her. Maybe it
Oh my
wasn't a total fabrication.
God.
You know?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, because yeah, absolutely. It made sense that maybe there was some logical reason why she had that suspicion, like it might have been actually rooted in some events that took place.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe she really got pregnant and miscarried. We don't know. We only
Yeah.
have his version.
We only have his version. Yeah, exactly. I was so curious also about like the character of Alfred Kiss, the policeman.
Yeah, I really
Um,
liked him.
Me too. Me too. I was trying to figure out what he represented because there was so much there about like war PTSD and like him sort of presenting a challenge to the sort of law enforcement and authority in Vienna. He'd kind of gone a little bit rogue. He was a very violent man as well, but only when provoked. And then that final scene of him sort of disappearing into the Vienna canals, it was really powerful.
Hmm. Yeah, I kind of saw him as a counterpart in a way to Fleur, like showing that like the society and the societal constraints and expectations, they're not just causing women to act out and be constrained, but it happens to men as well. Like men have all these expectations on them. You have to be a man, you have to be a soldier, you have to go to war, you have to be the provider, and that
Yeah.
that had really done a number on him as well, going through the war and losing his son and yeah, all of
Yeah.
that violence, and that's also needs to be addressed. So I feel like the creators did a good job of kind of showing the effects these societal systems and constraints have on everybody.
Yes, absolutely. Especially in the final episode when there's this kind of there's a very formal party hosted by the royal family,
Hmm.
and they're all sort of like dancing and to engage in a very formal way at this party. And then it kind of made me think a lot about what Freud wrote in Civilization and Its Discontents about how civilization is really the kind of almost like a masquerade that covers up a lot of violent impulses and
Hmm.
refuses to engage with that. And then at this same party, we have like a very chaotic, riotous outburst of violence. And so it's almost as if it's always suggesting what Freud wrote um, that the advancement of culture is really a product of this entwined dual state between eros and thanatos. And this is what pushes our civilization forward, actually. It's what makes us more creative. I guess, the negotiation between those two things.
Yeah, exactly. And it like all came apart at the seams in this show, and just like everything burst out. Then I had to forgive them for the episode 5, because then it made sense why everyone was having the blood orgy or whatever. It's like, okay, because they all had to act out in this way at the end.
Yeah.
How else are you gonna infuse a whole group of people? But of course, by animal blood and orgies.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, of course. That's a natural,
How are you gonna get
uh,
it to everyone all at once? It's the only logical way.
yeah, and this almost like a very infectious transmission of the violence through suggestion, through this kind of hypnosis technique that the two, that couple was using, the ones who were controlling Fleur, the
Hmm.
Hungarian couple.
Hmm.
And it was a really interesting idea that actually suggestion and hypnosis and suggestibility, it's not just something that is done formally in the analytic room. It's, we're always receiving subliminal messages, at all times. And so it really kind of requires a working through of what it is that we're actually being influenced by unconsciously. And also all the things that we internalize unconsciously as well through superego representations of authority, that we have to accept illegitimate laws and we just do it unconsciously. It's a form of suggestion. Yeah, I love how it kind of weaved a lot of psychoanalytic principles throughout the show, but in this narrative of a kind of, as you say, like a cult murder mystery, you know?
Yeah, fun, fantastical way. But I'm all for like getting psychoanalytic ideas out there. Like, I'm so happy that there's a Freud show. Like, why they threw Freud in there for a lot of points during the show, I'm like, what does this have to do with Freud? But then, like you said, a lot of the principles are interwoven in there. And the idea they said, for one of the, I think it was for the prince, they said, it's not really like when they get hypnotized, it's really just like letting them kind of unleash a bit more what's already inside of them.
Exactly.
I like that
Exactly.
as well, the id's kind of bursting out and the animal inside of them. And also, as far as suggestibility and like, we're getting all these information from advertising and all sorts of things all of the time, and they
Yeah.
they showed a lot the Bernays family, and they had their
Yeah.
little kids, and Edward Bernays is kind of the
Edward
father of
Bernays.
modern advertising, and so it was funny to like kind of have him in there as like a little boy.
Yeah, that's right. He was Eli's son.
Mhm.
Yeah, Eli Bernays. That's right. That's right.
Mhm.
It was. I do remember thinking. I do actually remember looking up Edward Bernays on Wikipedia and thinking, oh, that was in fact Eli, who was his father.
Mhm.
Um, and so yeah, there was this kind of like, I suppose, exploitation of a lot of his uncle's ideas and theories to serve like public relations and advertising and everything we now live with in terms of like the driving force of neoliberal economics, really.
Yeah, exactly. And he used to ask Freud for his papers before they came out and like send him boxes of cigars and stuff, send him presents to get them early. He totally read everything Freud did.
Wow.
Yeah. What a shadow side of Freud's work.
Exactly. Yeah, I was also kind of really intrigued to see how Sigmund Freud was portrayed as a subject, as a person throughout the show. And that actually really pleased me, like to see that his gentleness was portrayed and his how much he was such a deep thinker, and he was a little, his vulnerabilities and the fact that he wasn't immune to emotional disturbance simply because he studied it or wrote about it. He himself was also subject to difficulties and sort of psychological challenges that he had to deal with.
Yeah, it's a really good point. He was human, and that's how we all learn is like going through our own experiences, and that's it. I always say about psychoanalysis, really the best way to learn it is to kind of, when you go through your analysis and you kind of see all these things at play in your own life, then you can understand what the
Yeah.
theory's talking about more. Or if you use cinema as your analyst, as you do, it's just like reflecting on the different theories and seeing how they're at play in your own life and relating to them, personally. That's really the best
Yeah.
way to learn about it.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. Um, and this only made me want to like dig up old texts and like try and yeah, find new connections and a different interpretation of things I'd learned before. So I felt that the show had a lot of heuristic value in terms of learning. And like you, I agree. I think those who expect this show to be a historically accurate account will be very disappointed. But I do agree that it's nice to have a show like this out in the mainstream on Netflix, on something as mainstream and popular as Netflix, to kind of make sure that these ideas stay alive and stay fresh in people's consciousness, and that there's that we can actually build and write new roadmaps to arriving at these ideas and engage audiences. And as long as we understand that it's purely a kind of very imaginative reinterpretation of ideas and researchers arriving at their understanding of Freud through the creative process, then I think it can only have good things and benefits for us.
Exactly, because not everybody wants to write. I mean, there's a great series like the Genius series, Geniuses of the Modern World, and there's a Freud episode of that. But not everybody wants to watch historical shows. Not everybody's into that. So I'm all for getting ideas out there, in more creative ways as well. It's like
Yeah.
the better. I also really liked how they portrayed Freud, how they showed like what an outsider he was in the
Yeah.
establishment and how he kind of stood up for his ideas anyway, in the face of these
Yeah.
like really like biologically based medical doctors, because he was like really radical and revolutionary in his time, and people have tried to turn his ideas into this other sort of dogma and say that he was like really rigid, but you have to think this is like 130 years ago he's coming up with
Yeah.
this, and he was really radical, and I understand like he did study occult themes when he was younger, and I like the way that they ended it, showing that like this was a book that he wanted to write, but then he wasn't able to because of the constraints of society. Because that's
Oh,
something that's
yeah.
so frustrating to me. I recently wrote my own book, and when I was reading Lacan's biography by Elizabeth Rudinesco, she talks
Uh-huh.
about how Lacan, when he wrote his doctoral like dissertation, like his medical thesis, about psychosis, that he actually took a lot of ideas from the surrealists, and he was friends with a lot of them and was integrating their work and ideas, but he specifically left that out and didn't want to cite them because he didn't want like the medical professionals and his colleagues and his professors to kind of look down on where he was getting his ideas. And then
Wow.
we only find these kinds of things out later when he's more established and like more willing to talk about these kinds of things openly. But I feel like that's such a shame that people feel like they have to censor themselves or inhibit themselves because they're afraid of what these authority figures are going to think about their work.
Absolutely. I know it kind of is sad to think that those forces might have stopped so many radical thinkers from producing incredible work that would have benefited so many people. And so in a way, it's good to see that, yeah, the drive that Freud had right from the start of his career to follow his instincts and stay true to the things that he was observing, really follow the data of his patients and follow his own, I suppose, radical streak of wanting to invent something new, really create something different. And you can really see that, you can really see in the show what he's up against, like the massive obstacle of not just sort of banal, sort of administrative obstacles, but also the fevered egos of people who believe themselves to be unchallenged authorities.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of dynamic and tension between someone, especially like Freud, who in the show he appears to be not a terribly like arrogant guy. Like he's sort of just a young person with an idea and with a lot of passion, but he's not he's not an egotist. He's not doing it for fame. He's really truly driven by the love of knowledge. Like he truly is a philosopher. Um, so it's nice to see that this played out, and also in terms of Freud and his personal life, we also know that Martha's family initially was not too keen on Freud. They weren't too keen on Martha marrying him, and because they worried that he was a little too volatile with his career, that he was abandoning a safe, very secure career in medicine to chase after these kind of dragons of hypnosis and hysteria and psychoanalysis. And they were concerned about Martha. I think they were quite I think they might have been very traditional, very conservative people as well. So they might have thought of Freud as someone a little who maybe gone a little too rogue for Martha.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting that he had not only professional pressures on him to conform, but also personal pressures in his family with his in-laws, probably expecting something more secure for their daughter and her future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like how they portrayed that and how he also still continued. He paid attention to his own experience, his own insights, and valued like perception over what everyone was telling him to think. And he also paid
Yeah.
attention to what his patients were saying and was really listening to them rather than just putting them in categories. Also, how people had just already decided that people should be and think. And that's really hard to do.
Yeah. It's very hard to do, especially in his era, in his historical time, and Victorian values that didn't even, humanize women as sexual beings.
Hmm. Exactly. I know I've
Yeah.
only, it's amazing to say, but I've only really recently, because I've always wondered, like, how, like, even, like, how men have treated women like this for so many centuries,
Yeah.
millennia. I'm like, but when you have a daughter, how can you, like, continue to see women that way when you see your daughter has all these potentials and things? But then I finally realized, like, they just really, they just saw us as, like, animals. Like, we're just for
Yeah.
making babies or, like,
Yeah.
breeders. And they didn't really see us as whole humans.
No. Exactly. There was absolutely no respect given to us as autonomous beings with souls. We were just, as you say, like vectors of reproduction.
Yeah. And I guess in saying that, they also saw other people that way that didn't look like them. And also, animals. And now, like, everyone clearly is saying, like, all humans are humans and have full
Yeah.
fleshed out lives. And also, animals maybe should be treated a little bit nicer too. Animals aren't just animals either
Exactly.
in that way.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why it's actually in a weird way like very heartening during this time of a global virus pandemic to see that some animals have kind of been found in urban areas because there's no one there.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it's
They're
like,
going
I
back
wonder
into
what
the
the animal
streets.
kingdom thinks. Yeah, they're kind of reclaiming their world. And I almost wonder like what must it be like for the animal kingdom at this time? They must really notice a radical difference.
Yeah, exactly. Not so much air traffic, boat traffic, car traffic, foot traffic. It's like when we're all in our houses. It's also nice to see how fast it happens. Like as soon as we're all inside for a few weeks, they all start, yeah, coming back into the land.
Yeah. Yeah, and here in London, the air pollution is gone. I mean, I can't I've never actually breathed such clean air in London for as long as I've lived here, and as you say, it's startling to see how quickly that happened.
Yeah, that's good. I hope that we all remember that whenever this is
Yeah.
finally passed, and like maybe like one of our friends here, Per Faxneld, he talked about how in Sweden,
Mhm.
there's so many like air flight routes to every other city all day long, and like, do we really need this when you can just take the train?
Yeah.
Like maybe from like the very south of Sweden to the north of Sweden, like fine, you could maybe make a plane that way because it'd be like a 20-hour train ride or something. But otherwise, if it's like a 5, 6, 8 hour train ride, just everybody just take the train. We don't need so many
Uh,
air routes. We need to like be a little more mindful and cognizant of these
yeah.
things.
Yeah, I too hope that we remember this, when things become operational again, that this is going to force us to rethink a lot of our ways.
Exactly. We don't maybe need to be like Greta and take a boat across the ocean, but maybe, we could find somewhere in the middle or like three-quarters of the
Yeah.
way to Greta.
Yes, that'll already make a huge difference.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
It would make a huge difference. Maybe walk more instead of driving places, have more train routes in place. I know in the United States, where I'm from, it's really hard to take the train anywhere unless you live in like a few major cities like New York or San Francisco. But everywhere else, you kind of have to have a car. You can't really get anywhere any other way. So maybe, unless you want to take the bus for 24 hours or something. So maybe, thinking about that and putting more train routes in place and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah,
back
we
to
need
Freud.
it. Back to Freud. Yeah. I feel like this actually, I mean, this show has probably landed at the most opportune time because with people being stuck at home in a pandemic and with so many cities on lockdown, there's a lot of introspection going on, I'm sure. Like there's a lot of, maybe extroverts who are normally used to being social butterflies. They're now forced to be confined in their home, and there's so much time to think and reflect on yourself. So a show like this dropping at this time and kind of like remind us that there is an established methodology of introspecting, and psychoanalysis is this wonderful tool. I think it's a really opportune moment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's definitely coming at a really good time. And, as silly as it can be at points and fantastical, it's still like was much more entertaining than a lot of shows I've tried to watch recently.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
I
definitely,
agree.
it was
It has a lot of
fun. It was a
entertainment
fun
value. Yeah, it
show.
was fun.
You know, we need
Yeah,
a little bit of
absolutely.
fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think hopefully what people will find captivating about the show is the things that we've outlined, Freud's passion about what he believed in, his dedication to understanding the human psyche. And I was almost even thinking like along the lines of a show like this that kind of retells the story of established philosophers or psychoanalysts. I would love to see a show like this about Lacan.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, and,
Hint,
and really
hint
show
to
like,
the creators.
yeah. Yes, please, Marvin Kren, if you're listening, your next project is Lacan.
That would be
Yeah,
amazing. That would be really scandalous for sure, because Lacan definitely slept with his patients.
definitely.
And apparently someone told me recently that he would like do sessions in a cab. He'd be like, I have to go somewhere, and then make someone get in a cab with him and just listen to them on the ride.
Oh my God.
Oh, it's hilarious. But that's the thing. The people we remember are not the conservative people that play by all the rules and do exactly what society tells you to do. That's for sure.
Exactly, exactly. And even I can imagine a show like this about Carl Jung. That would also be intriguing, especially if they wanted to bring in the occult or spiritual element. I mean, they would really have a field day with him. I mean, that would just be
Exactly.
extraordinary.
Exactly. Yeah, this would be fun. Maybe we need to work with these guys.
Yeah.
We can be the like what is it called when you like inform shows about
Oh yeah,
historical things?
the consultants.
Yeah, we can be consultants for their show. I'm into it. If you're listening, hire us, please.
Yeah, yeah. I did really appreciate a lot of the just details as well, like the costumes and the wonderful locations. I believe actually they were not filming in Vienna. The show was completely exclusively filmed in Prague.
Oh wow. Prague is so
Because
beautiful. That makes sense.
it's so beautiful, and of course there's a very similar architecture, but also I think it was just more economical to film in Prague as well.
Mm-hmm. No,
Yeah.
the scenes were beautifully done and the costumes were beautiful.
Yeah,
It was well done in that way, most definitely. Like I want all of Fleur's clothes.
I know.
Why
Me
can't we dress
too.
like that now?
She looks fabulous.
Maybe I should start dressing like that.
Yeah, definitely.
Bring it back. It was amazing. Um, yeah, and as far as the occult stuff, like Freud did do like thought experiments with Anna Freud and with Sandra Ferenczi like well into late life. Like he wrote
Yeah.
about it initially and like presented it initially to his little like beginning psychoanalytic group, but
Yeah.
then at some point he decided that he really wanted to like make psychoanalysis a valid quote unquote science, which when you look at the situation he was in and the kind of culture he was in, it makes sense that he wanted to kind of, be taken seriously. And if he needed to cut that out a bit, then fine. He was really
Yeah.
open about a lot of other stuff. But they kept doing those thought experiences, into the 1930s. So it's not like he
Yeah.
dropped it.
Yeah, exactly. He always maintained an interest in it and a certain level of engagement. Um, and I'm kind of almost thinking about how like the point at which this series ended. I am kind of hopeful that there will be a second series because I feel like they ended right at the threshold of really the sort of his real induction into the world of psychoanalysis, his the entryway, and hopefully in the second series we'll see him. Yeah, we will see the beginning of his Wednesday group and his lectures and his uh, work with people like Adler and Otto Rank. I want to see, I'd like to see that, I'd like to see the kind of development of the story. And hopefully we will just continue this series until he arrives in London.
Yeah, I would love that fanfic. I would love this fanfic to continue all the way till the end. That would be amazing.
I know. Do you know what, Vanessa? Last year, my husband and I, we actually traveled to Vienna. I'd never been before. It was my very first time visiting there. And we stayed in the neighborhood where Freud lived and worked. So it was extraordinary, like every day retracing his steps, like around the park and the university and his old home, which is, of course, now the museum.
Hmm.
And while we were there, there was a wonderful exhibition at a museum in Vienna that celebrated 100 years since, the kind of wonderful cultural epicenter that was Vienna at the time when Freud lived and worked there.
Hmm.
And it was a real celebration of the people who contributed to the rich artistic life of Vienna and the philosophical life of Vienna. Of course, Freud was one of the figures that was represented in the museum. And one thing I learned while looking at that exhibition was that in those years, so like we're talking like 1910, turn of the century Vienna, Adolf Hitler was just a young guy.
Hmm.
And he was, of course, Austrian. He tried to get into art school because I think he worked with watercolors. He was a painter, and he was rejected. And he didn't get into the art school of his choice, and so he ended up kind of in destitution. He was in poverty. He was one of those artists that painted on the street, like landscapes and stuff, or like cityscapes. And apparently, he was in a path. So he would be like a street artist on a path where Freud commuted quite frequently.
Ooh.
So I would like to see, if possible, like maybe in the next series, like a fanfic of some interactions between Sigmund Freud and a very young Adolf Hitler, and the tragedy that's kind of building up about what is going to be happening in the future, and how that in turn affects not only Freud, who had to, of course, escape to London, but also tragically his family, where many members of his family, his immediate family, were killed in the Second World War.
Yeah, and a lot of psychoanalysts. That's something that I feel like needs to be talked about more. A lot of psychoanalysts were killed in the war. Some committed suicide to escape being killed, but like Sabine Spielrein, she was killed with her daughters by the SS after she went back to Russia. So it's
Yeah.
like they killed a lot of psychoanalysts. Most of them were Jewish. But that's
Yeah.
a really interesting point because this young, like destitute man seeing this like really up and coming successful kind of doctor doing so
Mhm.
well on his walk all the time. Yeah, and having so much hatred
Yeah.
towards him. He really
Absolutely.
actively persecuted Freud when when he finally had power and
Yeah.
could.
That's
And
right.
and Freud's
There
books
was a
were some of
real
the first works to be burned.
burns. Absolutely. Absolutely. There was a very conscious bigotry and racist hatred of Freud
Hmm.
and what he represented. And there was a very kind of interesting line, a quote from Freud, who, when he discovered that they were burning his books, he made this kind of like remark saying, how far we've come, how much we've evolved. 200 years ago, I would have been burned at the stake, but now they're content merely to burning my books. Now, of course, this prior to the Holocaust, which unfortunately ended up being, the tragedy of what happened. But yeah, absolutely, it would be interesting to see that a totally kind of imagined, fictionalized account of the forces that were at play at the time, because also in this series, in the first series of Freud, we do see how much there is anti-Semitism in Vienna,
Hmm.
and how casually it is kind of expressed to Freud, and how he's made to always feel othered by people. And this, of course, gets worse over the years. And we know that that when Hitler was young, living in Vienna, when he was poor and he had all this time on his hands and he was sort of idle, he was also radicalized by a lot of anti-Semites there. The situation got worse for him.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, they also showed that in the shows that they nodded. They did a lot of historical nods that you like you mentioned, which I really like
Yeah.
turning the actor's face into like a really famous picture of Freud or like Freud and Martha. I really liked that. But they also showed they kind of alluded to this thing that Freud wrote about where he had this like shame of his father because he was like walking when he was a little boy with his father and like some, men came up and were like rude to his father for being Jewish,
Yeah.
bigoted, and like pushed him aside or pushed off his hat or something, or the father like
That's
took
right.
off his hat and like bowed to the guys and like got out of their way. And Freud was always like really like ashamed of that and wanted his father to like kind of like stand up to them, not understanding, of course, as a child, like the full ramifications of how hard that would be to do and what would happen if he did.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we know how much that hurt him and how much that, yeah, it affected the way that he perceived his father as well. Um, I find that the actor they chose to play Jacob Freud is like uncanny. Like he really looked a lot like him. I would say also Robert Finster, who plays Sigmund Freud, was very good. Like he was very good at his impression. Um, and I like the way that his mother was represented as well. Like because we know that she doted on Freud so much, and she absolutely adored him. She was one of his biggest like hype people. Which is also something that he replicated in his relationship with Martha. Martha was an extremely supportive wife.
Hmm.
I always maintained that without Martha, there probably wouldn't have been psychoanalysis. She created such structure to his life and was there for him so much and was so dedicated and loving that he had everything he needed in her.
Yeah, I'm sure she took care of everything so you could just focus on the work. And yeah, they had
Yeah.
like 6 kids, so
Yeah.
she had a lot of on her hands.
She had a lot on
She had
her
a lot
hands.
of work to do. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and also Freud was a tourist. So he was like, he was very passionate about keeping order and maintaining structure and tidiness. And he was very strong-willed. He was very stubborn. So,
stubborn.
yeah. But
I've
yeah, I
never
think
been to
it's
Vienna or been to Vergassi 19. I have to go when this is all past. I have to go there and make a pilgrimage.
absolutely you'll love it. You will love it.
Maybe you can tell me where you stayed at the hotel and I can stay
I will.
nearby.
I'll share that with you.
That would
Yeah.
be really fun. I would love to
Sure.
do that. Um, yeah, and I also love how you pointed out how it ended. They ended with him taking his first patient in his
Yeah.
in his private practice, quitting the hospital and setting up his couch, his famous
Yeah.
couch.
Yeah. Yeah, it's lovely. I feel like they left it at a perfect cliffhanger for us, kind of implying that there's more to come. This is just the beginning of the story. We're gonna really it was just laying out the groundwork for how he arrived at his practice. And now we're gonna hopefully see the second and third series, if not more, of how the practice developed and the things that he learned from his patients and where he made mistakes and yeah, just those kinds of his process really.
Yeah. And I love the idea that he had written this whole book about this like possession and hysteria in the occult, and it was like forbidden, but that's kind of what his knowledge was based on. And also, it's interesting we have to note that his
Yeah.
mom was told by an oracle when he was born or when she was pregnant that this was going to be a very like famous man who like changed the world.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
So
So
his
she had
mom put that on him from when he was, yeah, when he was born.
and he was also the firstborn.
Mm.
So she placed a lot of expectations on him, but she seemed to be doing it always in a loving way. Like it wasn't an she might have been very she might have had a lot of standards for him, but she seemed to really be affectionate with him and love him. So she didn't seem like an overbearing, punitive parent.
Right. And she didn't seem to have a preconceived idea of what he should be doing,
Right.
just that he was going to be great and she was going to support his greatness. I love our
So thank
romanticized
you so
idea of
much.
Freud and his family life.
It actually makes me want to reread Peter Gay's biography.
Yeah, that would be great. And his I love Freud's letters, reading Freud's
I
letters. I guess
know.
we also haven't mentioned the cocaine aspect of the show, which
Oh
they talk
gosh,
about.
yeah.
But he does write a lot about it. If you read his like letters to Martha when he was like courting her, like which would be this period of time, he's always talking about how he took cocaine and like went to these academic events and parties and how he like wowed everybody with how smart he was. So he was definitely on it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was accurate. It was an accurate element of that period of his life that he really was addicted. He did have dependence on cocaine. And
Hmm.
also the fact that it's the cocaine consumption at that time needn't be confounded with how we perceive cocaine today.
Right.
So like that's the thing that sometimes I think people struggle with. They think of Freud as using cocaine or even sometimes abusing cocaine and think, this doesn't actually seem proportionate with how he might have been sometimes socially conservative.
Hmm.
But the truth is, at that time, it was seen as a very experimental thing. And I think he even early on in his career wanted to write a paper, or maybe he did write a paper about the benefits of cocaine and how he wanted to recommend it as a treatment for everyone.
Yeah, he wrote
Um,
several. I have them. They're
that's
called,
right.
there's a book called The Cocaine Papers.
Of course, yes, that's right. The cocaine
Hmm.
paper, yeah.
He wrote about it a lot and he was really, he really thought it was great, which of course you think it's great when you're doing it all the time. I'm sure it felt great. And it was also like much more minimal, I think, than what people do like illicitly, and it wasn't illegal, at the time. It was like
Yeah.
it was a medical, everything was medical substance.
Yeah,
So it's a different time and place. But no,
it's a
he wrote
different time.
several papers about it, and that was kind of the thing that tanked him before he found like hypnosis and psychoanalysis. Is that he was writing about like all the neurological benefits and benefits of this drug, and then like while he was writing about that, then it became kind of more well known that maybe this has a lot of bad side effects and isn't so great to take all the time. So like all this time he had spent researching it and studying it and promoting it was kind of flushed down the toilet, and he had to find something else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it sort of forced him to think about things in a very different way, coming off the treatment that he was absolutely certain was going to be beneficial. This was going to be the panacea for everything,
Hmm.
and he was really forced to reconsider.
Exactly. But the interesting thing is that even when you read his early neurological papers, because those things are not included in the standard edition, all
Yeah.
his like neurological writings when he was like strictly a neurologist, you could still
Uh-huh.
kind of see psychoanalytic ideas in his neurological writing. Like, so it was already percolating then, even though he hadn't formulated it so explicitly.
Oh, wow.
Hmm.
I'm so intrigued by that.
Yeah, no, it's fun. There's a book called The Cocaine Papers, and then even in his book on aphasia, which also isn't in the
Yeah,
standard
yeah.
edition, it's really speaking neurologically about brain function, but you could still kind of see his ideas and how he was listening to patients differently even then.
Wow. Okay, now you saying that makes me want a prequel to this series. I want to see him in the lab. I want to see him working on the eels.
Give it all to us. We want all the Freud.
Everything. I want to see him in Moravia.
And I think your idea of having different analysts would be great too. But I think it's interesting because when you mentioned Young, that would be like too obvious. So
I
it's kind of
know.
like if they had made this exact same show but with Young, then we'd all be like, oh, okay. But like the fact that it was Freud made it just like this like level of kind of bizarre surrealism that
Yeah.
gave it a different kind of kick, different edge.
Yeah, that's true. In a way, the twist to the young one would have to be him just being a boring guy sitting at home. Just something really, really kind of banal. That would be the twist. Because with Freud, you're right. Like because he was so intent on bringing about a public opinion about psychoanalysis that was like serious and scientific and rooted in research and observation. Yeah, it's true. Like giving it this type of twist where he's sort of like in the throes of some occult conspiracy, it sort of flies in the face of what he was trying to do. Yeah.
With full on demonic possession.
But also, actually, yeah, demonic possession. This is it. I mean, do you think actually, as I'm like talking to you about it, it just occurred to me. Do you think that maybe the way that they decided to approach this story, through this sort of like really outlandish occult stuff, do you think maybe they were tapping into the reality that Freud faced when he did sort of break away from his traditional scientific colleagues and traditional medicine and started to pursue hypnosis, and he went to Paris and worked with Charcot. He came back with all these sort of little bit like far out ideas. Maybe it was experientially how he received feedback from his colleagues and from his medical community. Maybe people did treat him as if he'd just been away with the fairies, something like he was at some seance and like conjuring ghosts and like maybe experientially that was how it felt for him, that he was perceived to be this kind of like kooky, eccentric guy.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And I think the idea then was like you're either science or you're this like crazy outlandish demonic possession seance occult guy. There was no in between. It was either like either or. So if you weren't using their specific methods, then you were like out in left field and you were completely ridiculed and tossed aside. So I'm sure they treated him that way. And I'm sure, yeah, like you said, it probably felt that way. And they did equate, hysteria before they understood it with things like demonic possession.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Just the fact that the word itself is rooted in the Greek of, the wandering room and, this sort of like totally, yeah, fantastical representation of female suffering, and kind of almost like relegating feminine suffering to this kind of realm of the absurd, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Totally
true.
discounted. And yeah, it's totally discounted, and it's also like it really shows kind of the weakness of those men, actually, the ones that are so like wed to their scientific ideas and have no room for anybody else's ideas, because it's like if they can't prove it or find it like biologically in the brain, then it can't exist. And that's such a
Wow.
like ridiculous point of
Yeah.
view. It's like just because I don't understand something doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. You know what I mean? It's like maybe we don't understand everything. And I think Freud understood that we don't understand everything and that we don't even understand ourselves, and that's why
Mhm.
everybody, tried to get rid of his ideas, because nobody wants to think they don't understand themselves and aren't in control of everything.
Exactly, exactly. The fact that he was suggesting that we are a mystery to ourselves was way too threatening for people who'd built their entire careers on convincing other people that they were fully in possession of the knowledge, that they were absolutely certain about, our suffering being rooted in physiology, and there's nothing that can discount that. It must have been incredibly daunting for people to be confronted with Freud's ideas, especially given the fact that he was so persistent about it. He just would not go away. And no amount of social ostracism would stop him.
Yeah, he still won't go away. I love it. And I
I
think
know.
society as a whole has like repressed him. It's like his ideas were
Yeah.
really, they finally found a place where they were becoming widely accepted and more widely practiced. But then it's like the society re-repressed him and decided, no, we can focus on like biology again and just take medication and not bring all that up. We're more in control than we thought. And now I think we're
Wow.
seeing that we're still not so in control of ourselves.
No, exactly.
Maybe Freud
Exactly.
was
And
onto something.
yeah. 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 And just the idea that, the fact that there's some level of self-empowerment that can be found in the admission that we don't know everything. And this is the classic kind of Socratic philosophical position of admitting that you yourself know very little, in fact, and you're then open to the possibility of absorbing experience and absorbing knowledge. When people like Maynard, who is represented in the show, he was really closed off, and that's a very tragic state for a scientist to be in.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Mary Wilde, Freudian Cinephile and host of the Projection series held at the Freud Museum, London. She's also co-host of Projections podcast. Mary has an upcoming course on the Joker on April 18th at the Freud Museum, London. It will be live streamed online. You can sign up at the Freud Museum website, freud.org.uk. Also be sure to check out Projections podcast. You can follow them on Twitter at ProjectionsPod. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Available from Trapart Books, 2019. Now also available on iBook and Kindle. Please visit our publisher's website, www.trapart.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, Sewing Strings, from the just-released album, Sound 23. Gained control of what images she would capture. Youth is almost always the emphasis. It is important to her what she wanted to remember in her lifetime, 800 of which remain. So and perhaps even history itself, act when it seems as if this is hugely significant for feeling and rewritten in a sense. Indeed this has been helplessness and hopelessness that one may feel dominated the rest by sheer force. Works have been found to have microscopic lens. He first began drawing the abstract art, including. Soon he found a way to fashion a microscopic, common or object while present, and his time, which inundated people and experiencing. The shift in the world has been to accepting. Many produce both a familiarity experience, not unlike the experience of art, as if this history of art, of dissonance, when confronted, similar brand of camera, putting the power of Bindi, citizen, for the first time. Conclusion of a clear pioneer of getting her due, the Swedish artist between life and art. The Viennese divides herself by not having off Clint, was interested in have their art, and may art have its disturbing. As the first shows of the manifest content of their attack on rigid academic worldview, while the latter, particles, plants, and such qualities and abilities, that such skills in work with the boundaries she left upon her death. training over a person's lifetime. While this art markets another frequent the radical possibilities of attended exhibition and art critics, dealers, and parties, if not actively persecuting their own groups and shows, ignored or unappreciated Viennese secessionist group, retrospective entitled during their lifetimes, in the ethically resigned from the association, reportedly aware of, off, exiled, but of course over time, main concern was with freeing for the guardian, become the new norm, and masterpiece of design, and no one design continues. Snowflake melted, that design was forever, capturing images of accidents, crime scenes, recall, reproduce, and recreate. This might seem was the time of prohibition, gang violence, and shift, life and narrative in a new way, in a way more in rather than what they'd been born into, based on